Okay, I think we are live on Facebook on Evolve and Ascend. So, hello, everybody. Uh, welcome, everyone, and thanks, Jennifer Sodini and Evolve and Ascend for co-hosting this conversation with Nura Learning. And today we are joined by Gary Lachman. So, Gary is the author of over 21 books on topics ranging from the evolution of consciousness to literary suicides, popular culture, and the history of the occult. He has written a rock and roll memoir of the 1970s, biographies of Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, Carl Jung, Helena Blavatsky, Emanuel Swedenborg, Ouspensky, and Colin Wilson, as well as histories of Hermeticism in the Western inner tradition, studies in existentialism, and the philosophy of consciousness, and about the influence of esotericism and politics on society. Gary lectures regularly in the UK, the US, Europe, and his work has been translated into over a dozen languages. He has appeared in several film and television documentaries and on BBC Radio, and is also the adjunct faculty at the Transformative Studies program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. So before becoming a full-time writer, Gary was actually a member, the guitarist, the bassist, I believe, for Blondie. So he's had a very interesting trajectory from rock and roll to the occult and esoteric scholarship. Really excited to kind of talk a little bit about that journey with you, Gary. And you're from Jersey, but you live in the UK, so you're joining us in the evening over there. And you're going to talk with us today with Jennifer about two of your latest books, The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, which came out in January, and on May 29th, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump. What a great title. So welcome, Gary, and thanks for speaking with us today.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure to be on. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I just want to point out I was actually the singer in the band, not the bass player. No, I'm joking.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, okay, so to get started, I'm going to leave a link as well to our a link to your book in the chat section here.
Right.
And
okay.
So anybody who wants to check that out as we're talking about it, please do. There's Elliot, who's my communications guy at Nura, tuning in. So yeah, okay. So why don't we start perhaps with, as we were talking earlier to prime this, about the book that just came out in January, which is The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, because I think that's really a key way to kind of open up and understand what this, the occultism and the alt-right is really about. And so maybe you can give us a kind of premise of that book and sort of what is this lost knowledge of the imagination?
Well, that's a very good question. The title actually comes from the Blake scholar, poet, and essayist Kathleen Raine, who for many years sort of headed what's known as the Temenos Academy here in London. It's an academy devoted to what she called the lost knowledge of the imagination, or the learning of the imagination. And this knowledge was also rejected and forgotten, and other qualifications that meant in some way, we no longer had it. And how Kathleen Raine came to it herself is that when she was in Cambridge in the 1920s, although she had been writing poetry and was deeply interested in poets, mostly the romantic poets. I'm saying she wrote a great deal about Blake, but people like Coleridge and Keats and Shelley as well. That she found that sort of poetry that she loved really wasn't the thing anymore. It was considered very, very much passé. And what was really in favor was more sort of what we might call poetry of the banal, or poetry of the mundane, poetry of the everyday world. And it was dominated by a kind of reductive, materialist, scientific, sensibility, which we're still sort of saddled with today. And strangely enough, when she went to Cambridge, she didn't study literature. She studied science. She studied botany, biology. And this is because she had a great love of nature. But what she found in studying plant forms and natural forms in scientific way was very much the other side of what she was finding through the great poets that she read so much. It was this whole idea of nature being this realm of these sort of eternal forms, and in some way coinciding with the inner world, imagination. But all this sort of sensibility she had to keep under wraps because it was considered completely just sentimental and nostalgic. But what she came to see was that why this poetry had this effect on her, and also more contemporary poet W.B. Yeats, was that it was tapping into or drawing on this lost knowledge of the imagination. And when you say lost knowledge of imagination, what we mean is that it's a kind of knowledge, a learning of the interior world, of our interior being. And this is related to levels of reality that are beyond the material, which again, at the time and still today was just considered sort of, old sentimental, outmoded idea. But as we know, prior to the modern times and going back, say, to the early 17th century, the idea that there were realms of reality beyond the physical, beyond the material, they were taken seriously. It was actually considered part of reality. And the idea that these things didn't exist was relatively new. And what she found was that the great poets that she was reading, like Blake and Yeats and Coleridge and others, is that they were drawing on symbols and metaphors and images that related back to Neoplatonic philosophy and ultimately back to Plato. And this is this whole tradition of realities higher than the material realm. We know Plato talks about the ideal realm of the Platonic forms that are not material, that exist in some metaphysical way. And this was something, a view of the world that was rejected with the rise of science. And it was considered all imagination in the negative sense, like that's just your imagination. But what Kathleen Raine discovered in the poets, and going back to Plato and philosophers like Plotinus, was that no, there is an actual structure, to use a kind of crude word. There's an actual geography and terrain of the imagination. And it's not just subjective, arbitrary make-believe. It actually has its own kind of laws. And this is what she would call tradition. And I just want to say, it's not the tradition of René Guénon or tradition of Fritjof Schuon. She didn't think too much of that, the traditionalists, precisely because she thought they didn't understand the imagination. But for her, it's not so much tradition in the sense of a set of rules or one teaching giving at one time that we have to get back to. It comes from the interior, well, both, ourselves, and it sort of is spontaneously produced there. And this is what she found in the poets, and this is what she called the lost knowledge of the imagination. So starting on that premise, I take the idea of imagination as actually being cognitive, as being something that we can know things with and through, which is not an idea that we think today. Again, we think of imagination as being sort of either fantasy, a substitute for reality, or it's on the cutting edge, it's somehow novel in some way, but it generally in some way it has something to do that's not real, things that are not real if you look up most definitions. And to look at it in the way of it having a cognitive power turns that around. In fact, you could say the imagination, rather than make believe, it's about make real. And this is this idea that I follow through in people, this Owen Barfield, whose chapter is devoted to his ideas, Henri Corbin, Goethe, Kathleen Raine, and then there's several other figures who I sort of come in and out throughout it.
Yeah, that's a great and succinct way to sort of wrap up the whole book there, as sort of this imaginative faculty, which is sort of withered on the vine, right, with sort of modern rationalism and scientism and materialism. But I think you're arguing in the book, and maybe this is a good tie-in now with sort of the resurgence of the imagination and the resurgence of the sort of magical, mythical faculties of mind are coming back, and they're doing so with sort of countercultures or subversive cultures, and in particularly today, right, with sort of the alt-right and the alt-light and the strange kind of marriage of technology and magic and archetypes and all sorts of fun stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, in that I mean, you say in one of the sort of sort of blurbs about this event that I said that lost knowledge ends, or dark star begins where lost knowledge ends, and what I mean by that is at the end of lost knowledge imagination, I go into this idea about somehow imagination having causative powers, and not only in the obvious way, which we know already. So you imagine what you want to do later on, and you go wind up in doing it, but on a more sort of immediate, almost ontological or metaphysical level, and that relates to notions of what's called new thought or mental science, and it goes back to late 19th century, early 20th century occultism, and the ideas that thoughts are things. Thoughts have a kind of causative power in the world that our modern scientific point of view just rejects this idea. There's an impassable barrier between whatever's going on up here and whatever's going on out there, and this whole idea that thoughts are somehow causative says no, that's very permeable, and there's whole traditions of ways in doing it. Obviously, magic and a variety of different forms of occultism are involved in that. But also, and it can sound very sort of simplistic in a sort of new thought way, or kind of strange and wacky in a kind of magical way. But the people that I talk about in the book, people like Blake, people like Goethe, people like Coleridge, even like people like Einstein, and others. These are not sort of the fringe kind of characters just hanging on, to the sides of Western culture. These are central figures there. And I mean, you can't get around it. They actually say, in a variety of different ways, but very clearly that yes, in some way, imagination is this sort of driving power behind creation. And one of the themes at the end of Lost Knowledge is this idea of the responsibility of the imagination. Because we might think that, okay, if it is the case that, say, since the early 17th century, imagination as a kind of, well, first, imagination as a kind of, cognitive agent loses its credibility, and increasingly is seen as something that's the opposite of reality. It's non-real. If that's the case, and if that is having deleterious effects on our culture, which you only have to turn on the television or look online to find out that that's the case. So then perhaps what would strike one as the the obvious thing to do is say, well, let's have some more imagination. And you're saying, well, just as you just said, it seems to be on the increase. It seems to be something that's appearing in a variety of different ways, and magical and occult ways, and so on and so on. That, but this whole idea of the responsibility imagination suggests that it's not any old imagination that's needed. It's not anything goes. And again, this goes back to what Kathleen Rain was talking about, a kind of tradition of the imagination, where there is, again, it has its own terrain, it has its own topography and geography, and its own laws and necessity, even its own inhabitants. I talk about Henri Corbin and his writing about Suhrawardi, the 10th century Persian mystic, who wrote these accounts of his own inner journeys in terms of these kind of esoteric or Gnostic tales. They're stories, but he's encountering individuals, intelligences that, for all intents and purposes, exist inside his head, much as Jung did when Jung went on his, celebrated night sea journey that he recounted in the Red Book after his breakup with Freud, when he sort of went mad on purpose in order to free himself of this, horrible oppression he was feeling. And he too journeyed into this interior realm where he uses a phrase called the objective psyche, which I've always preferred to the collective unconscious, and he doesn't use it as much as the other. It hasn't been picked up in the same way. But what I like about that phrase is it tells us about this inner space, that it's subjective in the sense that, where it is metaphorically, is in there, but it's an objective territory. It's not purely my own arbitrary, personal, subjective fantasies. So given that's the case, and if it is the case that imagination has a kind of causative power, there's a concern that without some kind of guideline, without some kind of structure, without some kind of disciplined imagination, who knows? Who knows what'll come out? Who knows what might be created in some way? And that's something I touch on at the end of the book. But then that becomes kind of the starting point for the next book, Dark Star Rising, which is precisely about this power of the imagination to have its causal power in the outer world, and it's being used for perhaps less than salubrious motives and aims. So we can get onto that perhaps a bit down the line.
Oh, great. So yeah, that's maybe to kind of like riff a little bit, and then that'll probably lead to another question. So it's interesting in terms of sort of this underbelly in the Western tradition, right? Because you really point out that there are a lot of people in the Western tradition, scientists, scholars, philosophers who are mainstream, like Bergson, at least in the early 20th century, was a very well-read philosopher who was sort of exploring these ideas. But then also, Deleuze, what Deleuze says about Descartes, right? That even Descartes had his angel's dream, right, and follows the sort of witch's flight into the unconscious, which is sort of the unconscious of reason, is sort of this sort of imaginal space, this sort of creative imaginal space. So then the question is sort of, how do we use this responsibly? Because what we see, and this is sort of the ethical moral question, right, with some of these thinkers who are being co-opted by the alt-right, and kind of put up on a pedestal, like Evola or Guinan. We've got some questions about some of these folks, like what does Gary think of Guinan? What does Gary think of Evola? Because a lot of these guys are kind of, I don't know, some of them flirt a little bit with sort of more classical fascist tendencies. Some of them were more men of their time, right? So they're kind of being used, since they are openings for magic and since they are openings for the imagination, they're kind of being, the rest of it comes with them, So the ethics question is really interesting.
Well, no, of course. Well, I guess it's the general kind of question in magic. We all know about is white magic and black magic, good magic and bad magic. The power, I guess, is neutral, and it can be used for good purposes and bad. There's the dark side and the light and all that. I mean, you're being very generous talking about Evola, flirting. I mean, he did a bit more than flirt. He absolutely pursued fascism, given that he wanted to make it better, and he wanted to somehow imbue it with the kind of traditionalism that mentioned earlier of Guénon and traditionalists. I mean, not so much Guénon himself, who aside from a very early period, he didn't really think in terms of politics or having kind of immediate effect on the politics of the day. It was more about some kind of elite group of sages that would somehow feed into society at large, the necessary ideas and values and perspectives in order to steer it away from its decadence and all that. And in many ways, I mean, in an earlier book, Politics and the Occult, I sort of see a kind of comparison between sort of Guénon's sort of undercover, hidden kind of really esoteric sort of approach, and someone like Leo Strauss, the political philosopher, who also spoke of the need for a kind of elite, for all the good reasons to sort of tell a kind of pious lie, in sense to sort of kind of fool the larger society in order to actually for its own good. And again, that goes back to Dostoevsky and the Grand Inquisitor chapter in the brothers Karamazov. But with Evola, I mean, and not only did Evola sort of try to get into the good graces of both Mussolini and Hitler, but he also pursued, prior to this, around the same time, the same kinds of sort of practices that are associated with New Thought and positive thinking and mental science. Again, this whole idea that through an intense enough and persevering enough and determined enough, focusing and visualization of some kind of desired end, that it would come about. And in the early 20s, he was part of what's known as the UR group, or the group. This was association of different occult writers who wrote under pseudonyms for their journal. And Evola wrote under a few, but you can sort of tell that it's who it is, and there's some accounts saying, which one is his and all that. But there's quite a few articles that appeared in the journal having precisely to do with this kind of ability of the mind to create reality, which again was something that goes back to an earlier obsession or interest of his, because he tried out a few different things before he sort of slotted into his career as a sort of right-wing political esotericist. During a period after, when he was involved with sort of Dada, he took a stab at writing philosophy, and he had this whole idea of the absolute individual, which was some kind of, in a sense, basically, it's the idea that, if the individual has a strong enough sense of will and I and ego, he's able to create reality around him. Although they're very different characters in many ways, it's a similar kind of obsession to someone like Crowley, with where again, magic in the sense that you basically don't want to be bothered by other people around you, so you sort of you create this world in which you can do whatever you want in some way, and you justify it metaphysically and through a variety of sort of philosophical arguments. So Evola was doing something like that, but he carried that over into his articles on mental science and new thought and the power of the mind in this UR journal. And then what he was trying to bring about at the time was trying to infuse these sort of Roman virtues, these sort of higher virtues, kind of spiritual virtues, and in themselves, they're not necessarily bad, sort of manly virtues into the Italians of his time, into the fascists there. And he wasn't, he sort of gave it up as a bad job. I mean, the problem with Mussolini's fascism for him wasn't fascist enough, in the sense that he envisioned fascism as this kind of theocratic, totalitarian society that would be guided by, a kind of religious vision, or a higher metaphysical vision, not the materialism that of socialism or capitalism. It was a higher kind of ideal, and but that could only be enforced upon the society. It wasn't something that individuals would take on by themselves. And so he gave up on trying to get that across to Mussolini, and then he tried to ingratiate himself with the Nazis, and he made a little headway, but in the end they sort of rejected him as well, mostly because, again, to his credit, he wasn't a thug, and he wasn't a crude thinker, and the whole kind of biological racism that Nazism was based on, he rejected and thought was rubbish. But he had a higher kind of spiritual racism that he wanted to say, well, you guys get rid of what you're doing, but take on my a more higher, more sort of thoughtful kind of racism. And in Evola's version, someone could say have biologically be sort of Jewish, but you could have an Aryan soul. And likewise, there could be, biological Aryans who could have a kind of, Jewish mentality. And I'm not going to go into what he considered each of those things to be, but this so confused the people he was trying to impress that they said, no, it's just they're either, let's just stick to biology. But he, perhaps I think in Evola there's a kind of almost naive idealism where and also this kind of arrogance. There's the arrogance of the philosopher who wants to see his vision somehow become real, and we know what happened, when people picked up on Marx and things like that. So it's a great seduction and temptation, and he found himself somewhere. So even though he wasn't a thug, he certainly got his hands very, very dirty, I think, trying to do this sort of thing.
Thank you. Jennifer, did you want to mention that Max Planck quote about, yeah.
So circling back to how the conversation began, with the imagination and science and spiritualism almost being at odds at times, I find it fascinating that Max Planck has a famous quote saying the mind is the matrix of all matter. And then if you look back to Hermetic texts, say the Kabbalion, one of the first Hermetic principles is the all is mind, right? So there is some synthesis between the two ideas. I think it's all a matter of perspective. I recently gave a talk to children at an elementary school, and we were talking about the power of imagination. And it really is a matter of perspective, because what I think is non-scientific in some ways is that people fail to realize, you know, almost everything that exists outside of ourselves, save for nature, is a byproduct of imagination. We're wearing, the desk that we're using, the computer that we have, this originated as a thought, and that thought turned into form. And, you know, you could take an esoteric path with it and say that this could be like a form of magic, but really this is something that was birthed from the imagination. So I think often,
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, James Jeans in the early 20th century, famous scientist, astronomer at the time, and he said, you know, the universe seems to be made of mind stuff. And Arthur Eddington was another around that time too, who said much the same thing. And you know, you do have, you know, you have Schrödinger, and then you know, you always have a variety of people sort of saying this kind of thing. But it's somehow even coming from those sort of, you know, very prestigious voices, it doesn't really change the general kind of view of things. And it's mostly because the sort of inner outer split is very useful, because it's very effective in dealing with the world. It's very, you know, it's very pragmatic, and it's very utilitarian. And our, you know, our great you know, the, what do you want to say, our success in you know, sake of a better word, as a species has been, you know, precisely about that, you know, our ability to be able to deal with the world more effectively, in the sense of, you know, recreate it in our own sort of image as it is. So no, I think you're absolutely right, because one of the big differences between the lost knowledge of the imagination and the knowledge that we have now, and the kind of way of knowing that we have now, is that it's not results based, and it's not quantifiable. It's qualitative, and it's more global and imprecise. And implicit is a word I use a lot to contrast it with the more explicit kind of knowledge that's, you know, it posits this kind of outside world that's there and solid, and it's always there and all that, and we can take it apart into little bits and pieces. It's almost about an attitudinal change to actually kind of recognize the qualities of this other kind of way of knowing, and not that it's in competition with the other, in the sense, because it's not going to put you on the moon in that sense, but it may put you into some other world that's not the physical moon out there, but it's in some other interior place. But and this is one of the problems that, you know, over the ages, that people that are aware of this other way of knowing, this lost knowledge, it's precisely because it's precisely because it isn't precise, that it kind of always loses in the argument, because it's kind of like, prove it to me, right? I can prove to you, if I do this, and this, you know, this, you know, formula here will do this, and then you do it, you put it together, and it does it. But I can't prove that when I play this, you know, part of Beethoven's symphony, or read this poem from Keats, that you were going to have this precise, you know, reaction to it. And then it falls into, well, you know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and all this kind of thing. And so this is one of the problems, where, again, because it's interior and it's not measurable, quantitative, it's subject to suspicion of being relative. Like, yeah, it's beautiful for you, but it might not be beautiful for somebody else. It's deep and meaningful for you, but it might not be deep and meaningful for somebody else. We can't trust that. This is 2 + 2 is always 4. You know, whatever. This amount of stuff is always the same as that kind of thing. There's no argument about that. The other things that are the deeply meaningful things, that we're constantly arguing about those. You know, if we could have figured those out in the same way that we could figure out that 2 + 2 = 4, I mean, we would have got rid of philosophy and everything else a long time ago, and just, you know, carried on with things. So it deals with truths and realities that aren't the same as the kind of utilitarian ones that we've based our idea and our criteria of what constitutes truth on. So this is something people like Heidegger and others and the Hermetic tradition is trying to do as well. It's, you have to get people to recognize the value of this other kind of knowledge, other kind of truth, in order to get, for it to sort of have its rightful place as an equal partner.
For sure. And I think in some ways it seems that as we progress in this modern world, that scientists is almost catching up with a lot of the ancient tradition. So you had referenced music, right? And one of my favorite quotes is actually by Marilyn Manson, and he says that music is the ultimate form of magic, right? And cymatics is the study of the visual effects of sound on matter. And it's very fascinating when you see certain tones, the geometry that comes of it. And I think that that's a scientific way to measure how music can actually have an effect on consciousness or something at a cellular level. It's very new, but I mean, Jeremy, I'd love to hear your kind of take on that as well.
Well, I mean, you can go back to Pythagoras, I mean, there's no doubt that there are patterns there. What are they called? The Chladni effect, where you have the sand on the sort of the disc, and
that's right, yeah.
You strum the bow to it, and it takes on these different geometric forms. And what I mean by scientific is that it isn't the case that you listen to a piece of music and you add up different things and you say, oh yeah, it's beautiful. It got wrote the notes right in the right place at the right time, and so it's beautiful. In the same way that when we add up, a column of numbers, it comes down to that answer, and that's the only answer it can come to. The way we sort of interact with it isn't that kind of way. So, well, I agree with you. Again, this goes back to this notion that there are kind of an objectives kind of, I don't want to use the word structure because it just seems so cold, but there are forms, there are shapes, there are images and symbols that have their own being, have their own reality. They're not just subjective, they're not just arbitrary. So yes, I agree with you that those things are there. But it's, again, it's the sort of thing, you can't prove to somebody if they listen to Mozart's symphony and they say, no, it's just rubbish. I'm sorry. You can't, no, you're wrong. Let me show you. You can't do that. You can try to convince them that, but you can't prove it in the same way that you could prove to them that 2 + 2 does not equal 17. I mean, you can sort of show that to them, and they'd have to be just completely, obstreperous or just out of their mind, not to agree with you. So, but no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the things that I was saying. It goes back to Pythagoras with the recognition that the octaves, and there's this kind of pattern there, and beauty, harmony is precisely being in balance. It's precisely when the things are together, when whatever it is comes together in a way that echoes or embodies that kind of inner inherent structure and pattern.
So speaking of sound, I just wanted to mention what Joseph was saying. Bassists are always the smartest and coolest band members. But yes, okay. So yeah, I think maybe. Yeah. So but I think what Jennifer was saying is very well put about this sort of, and maybe it's the kind of, a lot of your books, I mean, there's a sort of a narrative in your books, right, about how there's been this evolution of consciousness and how we used to use this more imaginative, mythical, imaginal, magical faculties of mind, and they had their own kind of science to them and reasoning to them, and more participatory ways of thinking, like Steiner says, right, that like thoughts have, or almost like living things, they have a form and a structure and qualities to them, and you like really have to develop that inner science. And then we've kind of moved away from that, and now maybe the future science is this sort of coming together, right? And sort of using the sort of empirical method, but really kind of understanding, you have to use this other faculty too, which you've kind of let wither on the vine, and need to kind of bring that back into participation with the sciences. But I think that's sort of what you're saying. And like, we need to bring this back online and bring it in conversation with the two hemispheres. Yes.
No, exactly. And a point I tried to make in Lost Knowledge is that the two they're not mutually exclusive. There really isn't the two cultures in the way that a famous book by C.P. Snow in the 50s had it, where I mean, we're in a way he's charting the beginning of something that we're experiencing now a later development of, where there seemed to be the separation happening then between the sciences and the humanities. And the sciences becoming more and more hermetic, for the sake of a better word, and esoteric, because only the scientists could understand the language they were speaking in, as things became more specialized and complex. And the kind of humanities sort of turned their back on it, and it was sort of, well, science is not, we don't need to study science and all that kind of thing. So things are bifurcating. There was splitting apart. But many of the people I look at in the book, as I mentioned when I was talking about Kathleen Rain, they had a foot in both camps. I mean, one of the central one is Goethe, the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the great German poet, who wrote Faust and The Sorrows of Young Werther, and other great classics of German and world literature. But he was also a scientist. He wrote, well, he scandalously took on Newton. He said Newton got it all wrong about optics and light, and he wrote his own sort of Farbenlehre, his sort of color book. And then he made some discoveries in evolution. He was an evolutionist before Darwin. I mean, Darwin didn't discover evolution, just like Freud didn't discover the unconscious. They packaged it in a nice way and got it across to a lot of people. But Goethe's, in a way, we can say his most successful work in science was, again, like Kathleen Rain, was in botany and in biology. And he wrote a book called The Metamorphosis of Plants. And he was after what he called the Urpflanze, which is like the primal plant. And it was something that wasn't just an idea in his head. It wasn't just that, nor was it a real, well, what we would say real, plant in a pot somewhere. It was sort of the imaginative model or blueprint or archetype from which all plants emerged. And what he believed is that if he studied a plant in its growth, in its stages of development, and watched how it went from one form to the other, because transformation was something that was, growth and transformation were absolute, ideals, fascinating obsessions for Goethe. And in his early years, he actually practiced alchemy for a while, and you can see still the influence of this idea of how things transforming into higher things and so on. And he felt that if he could observe the plant going through all of its stages of development with this kind of, at the same time, objective, detached, but at the same time participating with it, a kind of deeply involved love, almost a kind of love, and the same love, and love in the sense of, kind of dedication to it that a painter would give to a painting, or so it's combining this kind of precise, empirical observation with this kind of openness, where it was more of an encounter. What he wanted to do was he actually wanted to encounter the plant, encounter the Urpflanze, rather than the kind of invasive, cold, science of even at that day that he, this is what he was trying to counter. And he believed he actually could do this. He believed he actually saw. He writes about it in his Italian journey. This account of his travels in Italy and Sicily and so on. And he says he saw it in the botanical gardens in Palermo. And then later he met the other great German poet of the age, Friedrich Schiller, at a science conference in Jena. And both of them commiserated about how science was being pursued then. Everything was about breaking everything up into little bits and pieces, atomizing things, and so on. And that they both said, no, we have to be able to study nature as this great whole emerging into all its parts. So something from the inside going out, rather than something, being sort of just buffeted by all these sorts of, stimuli from out. And then Goethe explained to Schiller his theory, or his perception, his discovery, not a theory, not an idea, his discovery of the Urpflanze. And Schiller said, that's very nice, but actually it's just an idea. And Goethe said, well, if that's the case, then I'm able to see ideas. I can see ideas with my eyes. And this whole idea of being able to see this, what we can call imaginal kind of primal plant. Steiner started his career by editing Goethe's scientific writing. He was a young man, and no one wanted to touch Goethe's scientific writing because the literary people considered it boring, and the scientific people considered it rubbish. And Steiner, though, loved Goethe, and he was also looking for a leg up in the world, and so he took the job in his early 20s. And by working on Goethe's book on Metamorphosis of Plants, he basically got the whole inspiration for what became his whole kind of system. And what he talks about is supersensible perception and being able to see the aura and being able to see past lives and the Akashic record and all that. I mean, he takes it and runs with it. He goes, a bit further than Goethe did with it. But it's all based in this whole idea of imagination is actually a cognitive faculty. And I don't want to, it's not like, okay, bang, I turn on my imagination, because it's not something you turn on or off. It's there, it's on all the time, in the sense that we would not be able to perceive anything around us without it. In the book, I speak of it as a kind of intuitive glue that holds everything together. And because without it, actually things do sort of break down into a kind of, chaos of bits and pieces and stimuli and all that. And the sort of traditional scientific idea is that the mind is blank. John Locke, it's tabula rasa until stimuli comes from outside and bangs into it and makes impressions, as it were, and then we kind of put those all together. But people like Goethe and then Plato much earlier, and then Blake, and then also Jung and others, and they're all saying no, it's the other way around. It's like you wouldn't have a nature outside. You would not have an outside world unless you already had sort of the forms, the archetypes, these kind of the earth phenomena through which we actually see the world, understand the world, and grasp the world. So in a way, we want to unlock our minds in the sense that rather than say, our interior world is a reflection of the outside world, or our mind is a reflection of nature. We want to say, as people like Blake and Coleridge did, and people like Kathleen Raine and others, is that no, it's the other way around. Nature is a reflection of the mind. And again, this goes back to what Jennifer was saying, and these ancient Hermetic ideas, because that's another source of this notion that imagination is at the fundamental, at the basis of our very perception of the world. In the Hermetic Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic books, it basically is everything is in imagination. God is imagination. And Blake says, Jesus is imagination. And again, we tend to think of it, saying, what does he mean? What does he mean when he's saying imagination? Because our ideas about imagination, or is it fantasy? And this is the classic distinction Coleridge made between true imagination and fantasy. Fantasy takes what's already created and puts it together in strange, novel, unusual, combinations. So flying pigs, or a unicorn, or I forget the poet who said it, but sort of the essence of surrealism was sort of like seeing an umbrella and a sewing machine turning up on an operating table or something. Putting things that take them out of their original context and putting them in strange contexts, and they have a jarring, immediate kind of effect. But for Coleridge, that sort of thing isn't true imagination, because it doesn't create anything. It takes what's already created and just Velcros it together. And the Dark Star Rising, I say this is basically what postmodernism is about. It's a whole aesthetic of what Coleridge would have called fantasy, because what it does is take bits and pieces of lots of other things and put them all together. But the true imagination is something that goes down to the origin, down to those archetypes, down to those earth phenomena, and it sort of swells up from there. And as Kathleen Raine says, imagination doesn't see different things; it sees things differently. So you can have, a world in a grain of sand, and you can have, heaven in a wildflower, and all those sorts of experiences that we have when some simple thing seems to contain everything else, and it's that. It's the aha or of course moment where suddenly and it's something you already knew. I mean, again, this is something that came back to me as I was doing this book, and the whole Platonic idea of knowledge as memory. It's like this already, but now you know it for the first time, or you know it for real, you know it in quotation marks, or you know it in italics, or you know it underscored, however we want to emphasize it, because we don't have a word to distinguish these two different ways of knowing. But they're distinct. I mean, you can know something factually, you can give it cognitive assent, but then you can know it in this more deeper existential, you know, it's a kind of being, it's an experiencing that's a knowing at the same time. And that again, that's what the knowledge of the imagination is. We can talk all day about it, but when you actually experience it, it's rather different than all of our kind of ideas of what it's about.
So that's a great lead-in, actually, to one of the questions that we had in the email, and this is kind of talking more about sort of the moving into sort of conversations about the alt-right and the meme magic, right? Because here are a couple of 4chaners, right? People, I'm sure most people are aware of what 4chan is who are listening. But the sort of internet community space that's very chaotic. They're kind of like merry pranksters. They're kind of, that's their shtick, right? Like to be these kind of postmodern pranksters, teasing everybody and sort of creating this sort of chaos. But out of this kind of cauldron, this kind of postmodern soup, they created something I think they're just calling it meme magic, right? So they start exploring and finding things like sigils, and then there's Keck, right? And Pepe the Frog, and Peck, and then they create this sort of cosmology out of all of these guys. But it's sort of interesting as you were describing, like the difference between what Coleridge was saying, fantasy, and then the primary imagination is they're playing around with these ideas, and then suddenly they realize, oh, Keck is this name of this older Egyptian god, and then all of a sudden they kind of all get blown away, like, whoa, are we tapping into something?
Or is something
are they?
You? That's a point I just bring up in the book is it's as you say. No, there's a lot in there. I mean, we live in a time when truth and falsehood and reality and make-believe, the sort of the differences between them have loosened up quite a bit, post-truth and alternative facts and all that. And what the 4chan people, what they loved is when they pulled the prank and everybody took it for real. I guess the Scientology protest was, one of the first things where they kind of, they could have invented a kind of fake protest against Scientology, and actually they just put out a call and everybody turned up. I think it was 47th Street or somewhere in New York City where the Scientology headquarters were, and wearing the anonymous sort of V for Vendetta masks and all that sort of thing. And the Scientologists took it for real. They thought they actually protesting, but it was actually no. It's just it's like street politics. It's kind of like the Situationists or something like that. So that's one level where kind of true. Okay, when is a fake protest turn into a real protest? Okay, but that's somewhere where the difference between fake and true is kind of blending. But then the meme magic thing is what happened is they were discovering that stuff they were posting on the net seemed to be having an effect in the real world. Something called Synchro Mysticism had been, I think even you, I think it may have been an article you did or something. I came across that. But which, it sounds like synchronicities, Jung's idea of this kind of meaningful coincidence, again, between something happening in your mind and something happening in the outer world that are in no way causally connected, but they're meaningfully connected. They're connected through a pattern or connected through a kind of, it means something. And we're all familiar with those happening. So if you want to transpose that, like something happening in my mind, and then I see it happening out in the world, to sort of the internet world and the real world. And we can kind of think of the internet as a kind of exteriorized imagination or a kind of techno-astral plane. Because when you go from the poets over to the magicians and the occultists, the imagination is another name for, say, the astral light, or the ether, or the akasha, or something like that. Again, it's some realm. And I didn't mention it earlier when I should have, but it's sort of it's in the same kind of part of the woods as Henri Corbin's idea of the imaginal, which is this in between realm between the hard, solid reality and abstract ideas, you know, and so it's some in between where it's embodied, it has a shape, has a structure, it you know, it's not just abstract, but it's not sensory, but it's something we perceive in, you know, in imagination, dreams in some way, let's say, you know, probably the, you know, the most common for most of us. And so if you want to look at the internet as kind of occupying that space in the collective consciousness rather than just our own independent one. So the internet is this kind of collective exteriorized imagination, or electronic akashic kind of record, or astral plane. So in traditional magic, you know, the magician would, you know, focus his will and concentrate his mind and concentrate his imagination on, you know, what he wants to produce. So if you transpose that over to the internet, and so what seems to be happening is that these guys are posting stuff, and then they seem to see it happening in real life. And I guess the classic example, they were really into the Dark Knight Rises, and they had a thread called Bane posting, and, you know, so they started posting all these images of the opening of the film where, you know, the villain Bane is ostensibly being, you know, transported somewhere, but actually he's, you know, he's running the show, and, you know, he's let himself be captured so he can, you know, do what he has to do and escape and all that. And soon after, or not too long after they were posting this, there was the, you know, the tragic crash of the Germanwings flight in the French Alps, and they started to see all these parallels between the segments of the film that they were posting repeatedly. They posted a lot of them, and this tragic, you know, crash and all that. One of the things was a city nearby, or a town nearby. The crash was called Bane. One of the investigators, his name was sort of Bruce Robin, and we know Bruce Wayne is Batman's, you know, secret identity, and Robin is his sidekick, and so on and so on. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, but, you know, it's the kind of thing once you start looking at it, you say, oh, yeah, okay, oh, yeah, I don't, you know, it's, you know, he starts to build up. And so the idea was, well, if random postings of these things can have this kind of effect, what if we did it, you know, intentionally, for real, as it were? And this is when, I guess, you know, Pepe hops in to the picture. Pepe the Frog was, you know, a creation of cartoonist Matt Fury, and he's a kind of slacker, you know, amphibian. And he first appears, he's, you know, he's peeing in public, and, you know, someone basically asks him, you know, why are you acting like this? And he said, it feels good, man, and so on. And so that just kind of got picked up. And I don't know if you have to explain what a meme is, but, you know, it's this kind of, you know, cultural gene, as in Richard Dawkins' you know, coinage of it, and they get kind of passed on. And so this image of the frog kind of got picked up by lots of different people, and they were posting it in different things like that. And, you know, pop singers, you know, innocuous people were moving it along. But then he somehow found his way to the dark side, and he got adopted as a kind of mascot for, first off, you know, these sort of, you know, 4chaners and other online kind of, I don't know, what do you want to call it, cultural vandals, you know, or as they themselves say, they kind of live in their parents' basements, and they take pot shots at the world around them and all that. You know, it's a kind of, you know, rejection of everything. It's kind of adolescent kind of rejection of everything and making fun of everything like that, which in many ways constitutes, I would say, the essence of postmodernism, although postmodernism would deny you had an essence. But, you know, they started using Pepe as a kind of image to get across their, you know, their you know, sense of everything being, you know, worthless, and so on and so on. And then he got picked up by people that were supporting Trump in his campaign, because Trump is sort of like the ultimate troll. You know, he's the ultimate non-PC person, and not being non-PC was something really important to these kind of basement rebels, because, you know, one of the things is to be, you know, outrageous and all that, and especially when you're an adolescent, you have to do something that's more shocking than, you know, your parents did. So, you know, the most shocking thing to do these days is to be non-PC, and the obverse of that is the most authoritarian thing to do is to be very PC. So they're sort of made for each other. But then somehow the idea was that if you posted enough images of Pepe, because he gets picked up by Trump as well. He turns up, he's one of the deplorables, There was the film The Expendables, and Trump had what's her name? Hillary Clinton had sort of called Trump's entourage the deplorables, and she was very good at handing a stick to her enemies, with which they very quickly hit her. So they sort of embraced the whole idea of being deplorables, and then all these images went up of Trump's crew, Trump in the middle, and all his entourage, and Pepe is in there, and then there's images of Trump as Pepe, or Pepe as Trump, and a variety of other things. And so the idea was, if they kept doing this, they were flooding the kind of the collective exteriorized imagination with this kind of new thought. And again, the whole idea is, we're going to make this happen. And I should have said that me magic, it's an offshoot of sort of chaos magic. And a simple idea of understanding chaos magic is that instead of the traditional forms of magical tools and the circle and getting the name of the demon just right, you basically use what's ever at hand. It's the same way of found art. You pick something up, you take it, and you make art out of it. So they would use whatever at hand as the kind of symbols and sigils and magical tools that they needed. And one of the things was the whole idea of using memes as a kind of sigil. And the sigil is a symbol that a lot of magical power is concentrated in, and so on. And so they kept posting images of Pepe with the intention of this was going to help Trump, get elected. And hey, lo and behold, it happened. And the reason this came out, the reason this became kind of known, was that soon after the election, Trump's win, the National Policy Institute, which is an innocuous name for a somewhat non-innocuous right-wing organization led by Richard Spencer, they had their annual meeting in the Ronald Reagan building in DC. And you must have seen this, it was in newspapers and online and all that. And, they started, he started the meeting by, saying, "Hail Trump, hail our victory. We made this happen. We made this dream come true. We willed him into the office," and all that. And this was a victory of the will and all this. And, that kind of, his celebration there was met with, sort of Hitler salutes or Roman salutes, or I don't know, whatever you want to call them. But this was picked up by a New Thought blogger, a fellow named Harvey Bishop. And he posted saying like, well, it looks like, people in the alt-right, and Richard Spencer, coined the term the alt-right, the alternative right. They seem to be using a kind of positive thinking or new thought or mental science in order to, or they seem to have used this in order for, Trump to win. I mean, to take, in the first place, you have to, if you want to think this is more than some wacky stuff that these fringe people were doing, you have to sort of take the idea that thoughts are causative seriously. You have to, but if you do accept that, then it is like, well, why not? And Trump himself is a devotee of positive thinking. Norman Vincent Peale was his mentor, and he talks about Peale and his own books, his own self-help sorts of books, and he's a winner. And so Trump's own kind of philosophy is based on much of the new thought and positive thinking that deals with sort of making your visualizations come true, making your imaginative reality an actual reality. But the other strange thing that I found when I started to follow up on this is that, what's the one word that's kind of associated with Trump more than any other? And it's chaos. And he seems to be a natural chaos magician, because he seems to exhibit a lot of the kind of characteristics or practices naturally that chaos magic is based on, what its practice is. And I say this in the book, and he's, I like to keep things loose. I don't like too much order. I don't like too much structure, things of that sort. And, he's created chaos in the White House and so on and so on. And you mentioned Kek. Kek is an ancient Egyptian god that's associated with chaos and night and darkness and all this sort of thing. And through a series of coincidences and connections that I'm not about to unravel right now. Pepe the frog, because Kek was a frog deity. The Egyptians had, you know, animal deities, and so Kek was a frog, and he's the god of chaos. And Pepe is being used by far-right chaos magicians to, you know, so it all seemed to go together really well. It seemed to work out. It seemed like, yes, and this is where I say in the book, like, well, yeah, you know, maybe it's the case that there are these, you know, entities in the other spheres that are finding a way in now, precisely because all of our ideas about truth and reality and what's fact and what's not have become, you know, very shaky. Kind of the ontological barrier, you know, separating truth from reality has become, you know, very thin and perforated. And it could very well be the case that, you know, again, I'm just saying it's an idea. I'm not saying this is fact, but I mean, another version of the sort of you know, exchange between reality and non-reality is the whole reality TV phenomenon. And in a way, if you want to say that, well, I mean, what's the most popular thing on you know, on television? It's reality. It's reality TV. Reality is the most popular thing on television. So we can say that reality out here has like gone into the TV. Well, it's not a one-way street. It's a two, you know, it's a two-way road there, and something's come off the TV into reality. Well, Trump was, you know, the star of a reality TV show for many years. He was, you know, the boss. You know, he hired and fired, and he controlled everything like that. And so, in a way, he's kind of, you know, you can see him as coming out of it's like that, you know, that Asian horror film. What do I forget what it is? The Ring or something, where something comes out of the video or something like that. See, you can see Trump as somehow he's come out of the television screen into reality. He's made the switch over from this other form of reality into ours, where precisely because our reality has gone into the TV for the last several years. So these all these kinds of. I'm sorry.
I was thinking of Cronenberg's Videodrome.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that goes back some years. But again, it's all this kind of thing. But again, yeah, we've had intimations of this before, but everything's kind of sped up, and it's kind of all the silt has collected, you know, and it's like it's here, it's all here now. And I mean, I'm talking a lot about Dark Star, and it's not out yet. But I mean, a little spoiler is, I mean, I say in the book that I think Trump is the singularity everybody's been waiting for a while. Everybody's been talking about the singularity is going to make everything different, and yeah, he has made everything different, but not quite in the way that we wanted it to be. So
that's a good tie-in. I know we're at the hour, but if you're all right doing a couple more questions, we've got a few specifically related to the Trump side of things. But I want to kind of link this first, because a lot of another primer for this, and Gary, you've been involved with this. I've been involved in sort of the consciousness culture past 15 or so years, you know, disinformation and Grant Morrison's famous video, you know, about sigils and how to combat reality with sort of the, you know, like the hyper sigil. And my friend, who's also a Nura, he's going to be a Nura teacher as well, David Metcalf, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he was mentioning the same thing, you know, like this is, you know, the creating meme magic, you know, this is what disinfo is trying to do, and Discordianism and Mondo 2000, right? And then 4chan kind of inherited, I don't know if directly or not, but they really kind of inherited the sea in which we swim, which is sort of, you know, navigating a magical reality. So in some ways, you know, Dave was mentioning, like, we're kind of the most qualified to talk about, you know, manipulating magic and reality, because here we are, as you're saying, with this Trump guy who broke it. He broke that distinction between, you know, this talk show guy, you know, and you know, the presidency of the United States, which we thought was something a little bit more stable than this, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, you know, and in a way, it's sort of, I see it as the effect of like sort of what I call trickle down metaphysics, because it's kind of like postmodernism become, okay, it's now everyday life. Whereas it started out on the, you know, the sort of metaphysical heights in the late 19th, early 20th century, where you have sort of Nietzsche talking about, you know, this nihilism that's on its way. It's unavoidable. All of the very pursuit of truth has led to the recognition that there is no truth with the capital T. It's led to the recognition that all truths are relative. And so the very sort of foundation, the very basis of Western kind of, philosophy, or the Western intellectual quest, has been undermined, because the whole idea of any kind of, absolute truth or any kind of metaphysical truth has been kind of taken away. And Nietzsche said, I know this now, and nobody's listening to me. The people of tomorrow aren't going to listen. Maybe the people after the day of tomorrow, they might actually have an idea of what this is about. Now, I think we're actually have inherited this now, but it's kind of come down to us in this kind of banal, way in which it doesn't really matter. Like, who cares? In a way. I mean, we're troubled by it because now somebody's actually taking advantage of it. Someone's taken advantage of this kind of idea that there is no truth. Because at first it seems liberating, because many of the truths seemed oppressive and they seemed authoritarian. So postmodernism, deconstructionism, they seem liberating at first, because they kind of undermine something that seemed, too staid and, too constraining and all that. But the chickens are coming home to roost now, because it just doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop where, okay, that's enough. It just keeps going. It's the what do you want to call it? The dissolution keeps going on. And now basically you have someone who's much like, you could say, and I'm not in saying this, I'm giving Trump much more credit than I'd like to, but in a way he's kind of like the sophists that sort of Socrates had to battle against, because he could just, what is truth? You could just turn it around all the time, and you can make the bad argument the better, because you can play around with words and all that kind of thing. And so the whole alternative fact, post-truth sort of phenomena is being taken advantage of. I mean, Trump's both a symptom of it, and he abets it in many ways, because it's basically, I mean, he's the president of the United States. I mean, you think about it, I can't, that enough should be enough for us to sort of, get an idea of what, the gravity of the situation. I'm sure everyone knows that. But it's this effect where, like, ideas that, they weren't troublesome as long as they remained up in the heights of metaphysics, but now that they've come down, much as in Nietzsche and Zarathustra. Zarathustra starts out in the mountain and he comes down to the marketplace. And the people in the marketplace don't want to hear about the Ubermensch. They don't want to hear about the overman. They don't want to hear about, how to live to overcome yourself, but they want to hear about the last men. The last men are these people that have nothing to do but amuse themselves. They're happy all the time. And they're basically kind of, satiated with everything, and they have a nice high standard of living, and then nothing's important to them. And they basically say, the marketplace, people in the marketplace say, please, don't tell us about the Ubermensch, but tell us more about the last men. And I think we've kind of inherited that now. And again, but it's become every day. It's become banal. So the kind of existential crises that troubled people like Sartre and Camus, 50, 60, 70 years ago, who cares? It's whatever. We're not really troubled by that now. And actually, people are actively trying to relativize everything. This seems a kind of what do you want to call it? A virtue, a kind of virtuous pursuit to sort of carry on the work of destroying all distinctions between everything until they become into this bland kind of homogeneity. People are reacting to that. And I think, this is one of the things that the alt-right, or people that are disillusioned or dissatisfied with sort of neoliberalism and that, I guess, the social justice warrior sort of sensibility. They're unhappy with that. They find their way over to this other side, because that's really all that's kind of on offer. And it offers the opposite of that, but that has its own dangers and drawbacks and all that. And I guess in a way, what I'm trying to talk about in Lost Knowledge and other of my books is what you say, is kind of bring the two things together. I mean, it can happen. It happens in individuals infrequently, and it can happen in societies. It happens in cultures at different times. There's evidence of it in history, but it's there's no guarantee. And I guess we can see this time now as an opportunity, because, as we say, I don't make it too simple, but there was a positive motivation to dismantle a lot of these, outmoded, or let's say, oppressive, authoritarian kind of monolithic, truth structures. But there was also a negative sort of motivation, a kind of resentment at the same time. And that seems to be kind of the one that's having the most success now. It can get to a kind of forest fire level where we won't be able to stop it. But let's change the subject. That's a bit too gloomy.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of points actually to tease out from that, but I want to get to some more questions. So maybe I can kind of lead in with this statement, and then we'll ask Ray. Ray Grass has a question for us here, and so they kind of tie together because what you were saying about sort of the information age and digital culture and how it has this kind of it's a kind of a match for the sort of astral plane, right? Like William Irwin Thompson talks about this. He talked about this in the 90s with Coming Into Being and the American Replacement of Nature in terms of technology and how technology has this kind of strange, and Eric Davis too, with Technosis, right? Yes. There's this kind of intimacy with technology and a particular kind of esoteric idea of the astral plane or the collective unconscious, but particularly astral plane, right? And so Thompson is writing in the 90s, and he's kind of worried that sort of the sort of invasion of the virtual, which is kind of disembodying, and everything's kind of in that sort of postmodern soup where forms and images are shifting and there's no up or down anymore. We're kind of almost replicating that with our technological social matrix, right, with the internet. But the problem with that is, of course, the esoteric dimension of that is that a lot of things from that dimension might be able to start slipping in more, right? And that's what you're implying. So Ray Grass's question is kind of along the same lines, which is, he'd be curious to view how you view the effects of modern technology, the developments with virtual reality and the internet, CGI imagery, the media, on the human imagination. And so, like, there's definitely something going on with the imagination, but.
Well, I mean, at the risk of sounding like a dinosaur or a kind of Luddite, I think in many ways it's had a negative effect on the imagination per se. Let's say because one of the funny things, ironic things, is we want our alternative or our representation of reality to be ever more lifelike, ever more realistic. So there's HD, there's 3D, whatever it is, whatever the the latest thing is. Meanwhile, we pay less and less attention to the actual reality, which already is HD and already is 3D and already is there. So somehow, I'm sure we can trace back the roots of this all night, but we've somehow become fascinated with and are more interested in the representation. And that's what Thompson talks about in that book, which I reviewed ages ago. It's one of the first things I published in '91. American Replacement of Nature. So this whole, we become obsessed with the representation of reality rather than reality itself in some way. And I guess in one sense you could say a lot might have to do with the fact that we can manipulate that representation. So in a way, it's a kind of ersatz reality that we can kind of play around with whatever we want to do. These days you can do any number of remarkable things with film and video, with all the software and all that, which you couldn't do. But I have to say personally, myself, and I'm an old fan of science fiction and horror and fantasy films, going way back when I'm a kid. Although I know, that the tech is incredibly primitive, but when I see, say, a film with Ray Harryhausen doing the stop action animation, and then you see something like Avatar or whatever, where it's just all CGI. Whenever the monster shows up in a Harryhausen film, it's suddenly different. It's whereas like in the new CGI, it's all the same all the time. The dinosaurs look just like the actors. There's nothing strange about them. They're remarkably lifelike, but that's what makes them uninteresting to me. Whereas when the stop action comes in, it looks different. The creatures move in a different way, and they have this aura of strangeness about them that I just find not present in any of the the big blockbuster sci-fi films. I mean, not all of them. Some of them, but that's one of the things that I've always found, quite strange. But another thing about the technology is, I do think that it does suggest that Gebser, was right when he's talking about the breakdown of the mental rational structure. And one of the chief characteristics of this is what he calls the eruption of time. And even going back to, by now, rather simple technology of, say, TiVo or whatever it is, where, when I was a kid, again, let's say, if you wanted to watch a film, it was on at a certain time and you had to be in a certain place in order to watch it. You had to be home in order to watch it. It was on whatever, 9 o'clock or something. You had to be there to watch it. Now you can watch it wherever, whenever. So time, our experience of time is very different, just in the simple, banal, kind of way. And likewise with what we're doing now with the podcast, it can be, anybody can watch it anywhere at any time, whenever they want. You don't have to be, you don't have to be anywhere on the kind of grid, in order to do it. So again, that's more of a sense of technology being evidence for me, that Gebser, was onto something. You're saying that, and I do think that when it appears in these more banal, everyday kinds of ways, that's a stronger indication that it's actually taking place. Because it just seeps in there, and you kind of think, oh yeah, it used to be like that, but now it's like this, and people growing, or my own sons who grow up in this world, they take it perfectly for granted. The whole idea you have to be located, somewhere at a particular time and place and able to watch something, to them is just, this, God, it's like covered wagons or something. I don't even know what covered wagon is, I think, probably. So.
That's great. I think Jen wanted to mention something too, about the dark crystal, right? And sort of like the technical effects, right? So I don't know if you wanted to pop in.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm popping up. I don't see it on my screen for some reason.
I see you.
We see you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it's interesting that you referenced that, because, in regards to the imagination and in this, digital world and all the CGI, there really is nothing like that tactile, three-dimensional, like you had referenced, where in CGI films and you see the monster and it's just kind of like, well, there it is. I go back to like the Jim Henson Mind, and these puppets and these things that are actually created like physically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. So.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And again, I think all the attempts to sort of replicate that in a variety of different entertainment forms just don't work. But I mean, again, I don't mean to sound too what the word is, but in some ways it reminds me of, if you look at ancient Greek tragedy, ancient Greek drama, in the early plays of Aeschylus, all the morbid, gory stuff happens off stage. You never see it. It's referred to, and it's understood to have happened, and it informs the action of the play. But by the time you get to the end of the era of the great Greek dramas with Euripides, everything takes place in front of the viewer. It's like a blood-curdling event, when someone is being murdered or killed or something, and you see the head, you see the severed head and all that kind of stuff. So again, you could say, our obsession with getting everything realistic in films, and again, not only with CGI, I think with a lot of just regular films about that too. It's all about getting. It has to be realistic in some way rather than actually tell a good story, or be convincing. There's a difference between being convincing and being realistic. You could have the most unrealistic film, like any number of great fantasy films, but they're convincing. They convince you of their own reality rather than trying to ape or copy or replica this kind of notion of like, well, this is real. And I think this is another example where we're not allowing our imagination to do anything with this kind of thing. Because imagination is an interior experience. And if everything is up in front of you constantly, all the time, and then sadly what happens in a lot of these films is what they do, instead of having good soundtrack, film score written for it, they just take a bunch of oldie hits and and then just play it down. There's a whole soundtrack is a bunch of what is it? I saw my son's the Guardians of the Galaxies, and it's all music I didn't listen to in the 70s. But that's the soundtrack. So it's got this. It's just kind of splash spectacle entertainment. Here's a bunch of nostalgic numbers for you, and there's nothing for your imagination to do. I mean, you know, a great actor and a great director can have nothing on the stage, but just to the sheer force of their, you know, creative personalities, you imagine everything that they're telling you is happening. You don't have to have all the scenery and everything. So, I mean, again, it sounds like I'm, you know, a Luddite and all that. I mean, you know, I don't mind. I'll take that kind of stance because it really strikes me as true. And I mean, something else that I've read a bit about is this merger between sort of the psychedelic community, or, you know, tradition, and this virtual reality tradition, and this whole idea of, oh, in the future there'll be these fantastic kind of psychedelic theme parks where you go and, you know, you take whatever you take and then you're plugged into this thing and you have this complete, not just, isn't that what Huxley warned us about? I mean, isn't that what all these people warned us about a long time ago? We know we don't want to do that, you know. I mean, we're doing it already to a great deal, but it just, but I know it's consciousness has become, yeah, I say, you know, it's become a kind of, not a battlefield, but I think it is somewhere that's going to have to be, people are going to have to go plant their flags, you know, and kind of protect their area for it, because it's, you know, it's bound to be something that will soon be a way to make some kind of money out of, in some way. It'll be kind of taken over by some form that, you know, it can sell it back to us. And I think it's doing that already in many ways.
It's something that recently I revisited. I don't know if either of you are familiar with the film Lawnmower Man.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Yes, a little bit.
It's an old campy film from the 80s or 90s with Pierce Brosnan.
I remember the title now, yeah.
Yes. So it was actually very much ahead of its time, because the film is about this, I'm going to mess up the word of what he does, but he studies the brain, obviously, and he works for a VR company. And in using nootropics in conjunction with VR, he was kind of remapping the human brain. So he takes on a subject, which is, you know, a landscape guy that's not very smart, then starts giving him nootropics and puts him in this VR. And he gets smarter and smarter until he wants to merge and become one with the virtual reality. And it's kind of interesting because this film is from the early 90s. It's totally camp, like I said. But I think that that's the dangers of becoming lost in this unreality and believing this is a reality. And then when you compound it with entheogens or mind-altering drugs, I mean, it's the Matrix, pretty much.
No, I agree. I mean, it can't, I mean, obviously, you know, these, I'm not anti entheogen, or, you know, whatever name you want to use. I mean, these things can be used and have been for, you know, profitably for, you know, good reasons. You know, sounds silly, but no, the whole idea that this is the way. Because I mean, I have to say, from myself, I don't see the evolution of consciousness going in that way. I think the people in whom the next sort of territory in consciousness is slowly being colonized. They have a very hard time. It isn't fun for them. It isn't a big rave. It's not a big party. It's very difficult, and it's not so much because they experience altered states of consciousness. It's they become aware of wider areas of reality, which is not necessarily the same thing. Although in altered states of consciousness, I think you actually do get in touch with lots and lots of reality, but it washes over you so much. At least in my experience, it was like that. It was something that was so overwhelming. And also, you know, a great many mystics write about that, and other, you know, going back to the classic early self-experimenters like William James and P.D. Uspensky, the Russian philosopher. They all talk about getting into, you know, these altered states, and suddenly William James talks about increasing ranges of distant fact, in the sense that it was actually, again, it was a cognitive experience. He suddenly saw more. He actually perceived it. It was something that was actually there that he saw, but it was so overwhelming that he couldn't, you know, he couldn't bring it back. And he famously wrote, you know, Higamus, Pigamus, Menopoligam, whatever. He, you know, he wrote this nonsense stuff, trying to capture what it was. And when he read it the next day, it was just, you know, it was completely, complete gibberish. And so altered states of consciousness are different than, I would say, somehow becoming aware of wider areas of reality. And that's a slower process. And again, I'm no master of it. This is just a distinction I make for myself. And And that's why I've sort of taken the route of sort of more philosophy and a kind of interior sort of journey or mapping. But because this is consciousness is this is what I have. I'm awake now. This is my consciousness. It isn't, you know, I'm slightly altering it a little bit by sipping a little wine when I'm talking to you, but it's not in some other, you know, strange ninth dimension with munchkins or something around me. It's like, here it is now. And if I'm going to advance from this in any way without just sort of taking a holiday from it, I have to basically learn what this is about now and then slowly extend that. And people I've been interested in are, you know, are ones that I felt have tried to do that. Colin Wilson, you know, I've written a book about, and my readers know that he's been a major influence on me, and others as well. But it's I think it's more of a traditional kind of approach to these things. We're talking about tradition. It's more of a traditional kind of approach where you're going back to this knowledge of the imagination, and this leads back to Plato, leads back to Plotinus, it leads back to philosophy, it leads back to understanding the mind, becoming aware of it, because we all have one, but it's actually revelation when you suddenly realize that you actually do have one, and it's really there, and you can do things with it. And again, not to sound too sort of negative, but I think people should, you know, don't occupy Wall Street, occupy your mind, you know, because it's there. And I don't mean don't protest, I don't mean that in a sense, but I just mean you don't have to go out and do some visible activism in order to sort of affect some kind of change and to move things on. You already have the new territory. The new territories are within us already. And what I feel is necessary to do is go in and to map those in the way that the people I write about try to do it, not just like blasting off into outer space, but, you know, slowly and oftentimes, you know, laboriously trying to get a hold. And this is what all the spiritual traditions are about, you know, any kind of form of meditation is all about that as well. I mean, it's a slow process.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of ethos or kind of, I don't want to put it too strongly, but in a way it is sort of a mandate, right, for any philosopher of the imagination or of the imaginal, which is a mistake that we can all make. And that is to reduce the icons into idols, right? To take something even like a psychedelic, entheogenic, technodelic experience, what, you know, all of the cool things we're doing with our technology and our magic now, and kind of reducing them and flattening them into this sort of thing that will give us, you know, seeing through those things is us. Like, we have to participate. So to the degree that, like, I think what you're doing, or William Irwin Thompson, or just anybody who kind of tries to see through the appearances, right? Like saving the appearances, that's sort of like, that's really the only way we can move forward with all of this technology.
Yes, I think you're right. It's in a way you could say it's a difference between just going off on a trip, I guess, you know, no pun intended, but you come back to the same, you know, back to the same place. Whereas, you know, if you widen your interior, it's almost as if you're going into a different space. But, you know, you're not physically going somewhere else, but your interior world is widening out and all that. And again, this was the cognitive content of so many of these mystical experiences I've read about. I mentioned Uspensky, who's most known as a student of Gurdjieff, but when he was experimenting with nitrous oxide in the early 20th century, he talks about at one point looking over at an ashtray, and suddenly everything to do with the ashtray just hit him at once. You know, the whole history of smoking, the copper that the ashtray was made of, the whole history of mining and oring and smelting, and it just so many things. And none of these things by themselves was mystical in any way. There were things you could go look up, you could go find out in the encyclopedia, but it came to him all at once. This is, again, it's the idea that the simplest kinds of things contain everything else in them. And if only, as I said before, Kathleen Rain says, the idea isn't to see different things, it's to see things differently. And if you can see them from this other perspective, you can suddenly see everything else that is connected to them in some way. And again, it's no good for that to overwhelm us, although it may be fun. We might like that experience. But if we actually want to map these things out, we have to kind of just go, you know, slowly and slowly. So Uspensky had that experience, and he didn't go and continue to take nitrous oxide. He spent great many years trying to understand what that one experience or that one series of experiments meant for him. And he wrote a fantastic essay about it called Experimental Mysticism. And I think it's one of the most important kind of accounts of this kind of, altered state experience. It's not as well known as it should be, but he's a very good writer. So it's very readable, but it's also very, very meticulously step by step. It's not, oh, wow. You know what I mean? It's like he's going through it step by step and trying to explain and trying to turn it into, he's basically trying to turn it into language so he can pass that knowledge on to somebody else. And I think that is the other side. That's why you need both brains. You need to have the intuitions, you need to have the mystical experiences, the participatory consciousness through the right brain, let's say, but that has to be structured and translated into language so that we can capture it. So it doesn't just, pass by. It isn't just an experience. It's something that we can capture the essence of and house it in language. And Owen Barfield, he says the whole history of consciousness is in our language. We can trace back what earlier consciousness was like by studying the history of language. And so what our consciousness is like now, can be seen or understood through the tools that we use to talk about, and that's language. Again, so it's a slow process of trying to, and Gebser, we all know Gebser has fantastic, things to tell us, but he wrestles with the language trying to tell us it's a this, it's a that, it's atemporal, it's aspatial, meaning it's not temporal, but I can't tell you precisely what it is, but it's not that. And that's the whole tradition in the West anyway, where we can talk about these transcendental things only in a way where we can set them apart from,
via negativa, right?
Yeah, via negativa and things like that. So again, that's all these parallels are there. They're there. Once you start talking about them, they link up into other things, and you can see this kind of dialogical process going on. And we're part of that. Doing that now, we're part of that. And awakening to the fact that we're part of that would be a kind of encountering the being, encountering the our immediacy. And that's the kind of thing I think that we want to do too. Because that's where we get the energy. We get excited because we realize actually this isn't something that's happened in the past. This isn't something that's just a book. It's actually something that we're participating in, and everyone who's involved now is in this event is participating in it as well.
So. Yeah, I suppose we should wrap it up unless you got time for just a quick fire question or two.
I think wrapping up is a good idea if you don't mind.
Okay, no problem. This has been wonderful, Gary. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you, all the listeners and participants out there.
Yes, thanks, everybody. Links to the books are in the chat. And I hope you join us again for another talk sometime soon.
I'd absolutely love to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Okay, take care.